Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with Father James Dominic Rooney. We're here to talk about Universalism. Father, how have you been since the last time we talked? What are you up to right now?
Well, I'm just reveling in being Father Hell for the moment. I have like three more interviews about Universalism this week. Uh, I also have a talk in Macau next January for St. Thomas Aquinas's feast day. I'm going to talk about hell.
Nice.
So I should say I decided as a result of this debate to work on a book I've been thinking about for some time, but this really gave me the impetus for it. It's a book on grace and free will. So I've been working on problems with grace and free will for the past 5 to 6 years,
Mhm.
individual articles I've written. And this pushed me to sort of, I think I can finish it maybe by the end of the summer. So I'm gonna, aim for that. But the current title is the same as the title of my talk in Macau,
Mhm.
Not a Hope in Hell. That's the book title.
Oh,
It's
you're
going to be
right.
about grace and free will and end with the classical problem, why God permits evil.
Well, Father, that sounds like it's going to be really exciting. And I also learned in my time with the Dominicans that, when a friar is called, let's say like, I don't know, Joseph Thomas, James Dominic, or I don't know, Thomas Peter, whatever, it's really significant that you mention both of the names, the religious names, if you will. So are you like that too? Because I'm sure like if James is your baptismal name, Dominic is included, right, with the religious life. Do you prefer people to call you Father James Dominic?
I mean, James Dominic is my name, but I'm not very particular. So I should say my religious name is James Dominic. So
Hmm.
neither is my baptismal name.
I see.
I'm named after two Japanese Dominican martyrs,
Mm.
James Kishe Tominaga and Domingo Ibanez, who were both killed in Japan in the 1600s.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I actually didn't know that, so that's really wonderful to learn. And it's a beautiful backstory. Well, Father, today we're talking about though something that might seem quite grim to others, right? A critique of universalism. And so I think the first question I want to ask you is, what inspired you to write at least the two articles you have up on Notre Dame's website, The Incoherencies of Hard Universalism and Hell and the Coherence of Christian Hope. And before we started the recording, I told you you have a lot of guts, and you said no, it's really insanity. So, did you know that you're going to get yourself into boiling hot water with this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I didn't know the extent to which things would happen, but on the other hand, I could have predicted it, so
Hmm.
it wasn't a total surprise or anything. But I'll say quite bluntly, I've been talking with some of the people who are involved in this universalism stuff for a while. So, I've talked with Father Al Kimmel, who runs a theology blog. He tends to share this material regularly. And I guess part of my concern is very straightforward. So, universalism in the past has been associated with sort of free church Protestantism, or like the Unitarian Universalists,
Hmm.
and has been relatively marginal. But there's a sort of troubling trend that I'll tell you why a little later. In the Catholic Church, we had a sort of surge of universalism in the 1960s,
Mm.
and it
Yeah.
went through the changes after Vatican II. And in the Catholic Church, that change was associated with that push for universalism was associated with very weird theologies of God, plus denial of original sin. So one of the brothers from my province, Matthew Fox, who was excommunicated, held a view like this. And the church actually in the 1980s, 1990s had to condemn it again. So there were views, for example, in moral theology, that nobody could commit a mortal sin. You
Mm.
could never fulfill the condition of having full knowledge aside from grave matter and deliberate intent to commit a mortal sin. This was called fundamental option theories. They were condemned in Veritatis Splendor. I'll mention that a little later, what those are. And then also this view on that there's no possible hell was condemned in 92 during the Synod of Bishops. The CDF had to issue a document condemning universalism again. So the difficulty today is rather similar to the difficulty in the 1960s, where what has happened, I think, that's really serious about universalism today is universalism to people who don't know much about it or aren't thinking too much about it can look like a very innocent thing to think, to worry about, what if my loved ones are in hell? What if I go to hell? That's a very scary thought for some people, and I understand it. And people also worry. They're raised in an environment where they're around people maybe who've given them a sort of terrifying view of hell to scare them into submission. Maybe they come from that kind of religious background with like Calvinism. I know my teacher Eleanor Stump talked about those kinds of Calvinistic pictures in her own upbringing. I can understand people rejecting that, certainly. But the problem today that's very, very different and I think makes the case much more serious is universalism today is associated with a rise of very heretical, and I was telling you, Swan, before we got started, sort of big time heresy kind of problems, like the Arian heresy kind of problems in what we think about God. And this was the case in the 1960s among Catholic theologians that went this way too. And it's coming back. And it's coming back with a vengeance among Orthodox and Catholic theologians. And this is, to be quite honest, why I think it needs to be dealt with. Somebody needs to say something about that, because I think otherwise people are going to get led into believing something that looks relatively innocent. But if you don't make the right distinctions, if you aren't careful what you're saying, you can very easily end up denying something central to Christianity. So that's basically why I think, believing heresies is bad. But the reason heresies are bad is because they're false and they usually undermine the whole Christian story. And they don't let on to that right at the beginning. And so I think universalism's like any other. There's a sort of attempt to overemphasize some aspect of the Christian mystery and eliminate others to make it easier to palate, more rationalizing, more easy to rationalize. And in this case, I think basically what you get if you accept universalism is it undermines the cross. The cross doesn't make any sense. The whole traditional Christian story of why Jesus died for us doesn't make any sense if universalism is true. So that's where I'm very worried about universalism, is because if you accept this view, you end up undermining Christianity pretty significantly.
I can, having been in the universalist debate before and kind of now backing away from it, it's kind of fun to hear what you're saying. And I can already kind of hear like all the responses that are going to be coming and all the like frustration and stuff. And so, Father, I think, what you're doing is you're simply laying out your case and some of the propositions and the conclusion that you're going to come to. So I had to caution people to just like, hey, let Father James Dominic get his case out. Okay. So he's just laying out the opening kind of propositions he's defending. But speaking of just kind of also opening kind of clarifications and statements, in your second article, Hell and the Coherence of Christian Hope, in the second paragraph, you have this line here that really spoke to me. And to provide some context for why I'm mentioning it, so in my reaction to Cameron Bertuzzi video, I talked a little bit about eternal conscious torment, why I'm not a big fan of the term. And it was because we previously had a conversation together where you kind of explained why you're not a fan of the term. And I was like, wow, that exactly captures, right, like my feeling on the language that's going on here, because I think it does get into some of those abusive pictures of God. So in the article, you write this: I therefore reject the moniker eternal, eternal conscious torment for the traditional doctrine, as God does nothing to torment anyone. This was my response to the way in which God might have good reasons for allowing hell. If God allowed hell, hell could be nothing other than an expression of God's mercy and love, even for the damned. End quote. So could you explain a little bit then about, what do you mean by God does nothing to torment anyone? Why do you not like the moniker eternal conscious torment?
Yes. So let me just express very quickly the traditional Catholic doctrine of hell. So the Catholic doctrine of hell, the Orthodox doctrine, is, I think, relatively straightforward. Hell is nothing more than persisting in sin forever.
Mm,
That's it. That's basically it. So all you need, as it were, for somebody to think there's a hell, is you think that there is the possibility of persisting in what we call mortal sin, lacking grace in your soul by some act that you did, you know, um, responsibly. I do something that causes me to lack grace, and I persist in that forever.
mm,
It's a case of wanting something other than God. You're in love with something or desire something other than God, and you persist that way forever. And on the Catholic doctrine, what happens after you die is that this possibility, if you persist in sin forever like that, it's going to cause you what we call the pain of conscience. The worm of conscience is
mm.
considered the primary torment of hell, and it's basically
Yeah.
a kind of regret or despair over wasting my life. Um, because when I end up in the afterlife, I, am faced with my decisions. I'm faced with what has happened in my life, and this is considered the primary pain of hell. But the Catholic doctrine is very clear: God doesn't predestine anybody to hell. God doesn't do anything to cause people to go to hell. God gives everybody sufficient grace to be saved, and so all good in our lives comes from God, and all the evil in our life comes from us. So this is why I say God doesn't torment anybody in hell. There is a famous classical doctrine where in our scriptures, as well as in our doctrinal statements, it says things like this: in hell there's fire.
Yeah.
There's fire.
Mm,
And these have been debated among theologians for a long time, what fire means and refers to in this case. And scripture isn't clear about it, and theologians have debated it. There are some people that think it's a material fire. Aquinas early on claims in his commentary on the sentences it's a material fire. Other people disagreed, even classically, and the church has never pronounced on it.
mm,
So, one of the things I endorse in my early paper and in a one I'm hopefully going to publish soon is I think the right way to understand the fire is actually as an incorporeal spiritual fire.
mm.
So I appreciate this doctrine, which I think is very classical. In fact,
Yeah.
it comes from two particular theologians that I'm appealing to, two different saints. Saint Isaac of Nineveh is a Syriac uh, saint, and he wrote famously a sort of account of hell, that it's the same fire that delights the saints in heaven that torments the people in hell. So it's just received. God's love is received in two ways by the people in heaven and hell, and it's their state of their will that causes pain to them, not what God is doing. So St. Maximus the Confessor actually says something very similar. He says the union with God, he corrects Origen and Gregory of Nyssa. He says they were right about this idea. God is going to restore us all at the end of time. But he says, here's what's going to happen: God's going to restore our human nature and divinize it, make it like Jesus's in the resurrection. Our human nature is going to be like that. And our powers of our soul are going to be enhanced. But God isn't going to change our wills. That would be manipulating our nature,
Mm,
destroying what we are in life. And so he says this is what's going to happen. The divinizing activity of God's energies are going to fill everybody, the damned as well as the blessed. And what's going to happen is if you're one of the damned, you have given up on God's grace, you're resistant to it. And so, God, what he's doing is going to make you immortal, make you beautiful, as it were,
mm,
if you are open to it, and it will delight you. It will give you, the beatific vision. But for people that are resistant to it from their life, they've created a character, a personality that opposes them to God. Then it will cause them pain. He says it will cause eternal ill-being as opposed to well-being in the people in the blessed, the saints in heaven. And I think this is the right way to understand the fire of hell,
Mm.
is God doesn't do anything intrinsically suited to cause pain to people. The pain is purely accidental to what God is doing. So I think, in fact, I can tell you maybe at the end a little bit more about my picture of why God allows hell. But I think on this model, uh, God isn't imposing anything. He's not inflicting anything
Mhm.
on people. He's not trying to like give them what they're owed by, beating them with a stick or sending the little demons to poke them. On this picture, what causes them pain is sort of themselves.
Mm.
God reveals himself to them, and because they don't like God, because they never had any hope. I mentioned this in my second article. People that don't trust God or don't love him. I was just watching. I'll give you a little story. I just watched a famous clip of Stephen Fry, the atheist,
Yeah.
and somebody asked him in a TV interview, "What are you going to do?" He's a famous atheist. They asked, "What happens, Stephen, if you end up, you're dead, and you show up at the pearly gates, and there's St. Peter and God, and they say, 'Guess what, Stephen, you were wrong. Is there anything you'd like to tell me?'" And Stephen Fry says, "The first thing I'd tell God is, 'How dare you? How dare you? I wouldn't want to go in there at all. He has caused so much pain and suffering and unnecessary evil in the world. Parasites that crawl outside of children's eyes." He goes on a sort of
Mhm.
laundry list of all the evils, and he says, "I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that kind of God." Um, and I think that's, if I can put it this way, that's exactly my picture of hell,
Mm.
is encapsulated in that interview, which is, if you encounter the God who is really goodness and love, that's what he is. But if you don't like that sort of thing, then I couldn't think of anything more painful than to be joined to him and not being able to look away, not being able to shift your attention for eternity. Uh, and so that's essentially what I'm thinking of here, as what I mean when I say it's not eternal conscious torment. God's not inflicting anything, but it's certainly the case that people could form themselves this way, to expect something of God, to be opposed to what he ends up being, and their hearts being disposed against him will cause them pain. I think it's pretty clear there'd be psychic pain there. I think even in our life, we can see why that'd be the case.
Father, do you have any comments on? I know some Catholics have talked to me about there being like a pain of sense somehow in hell, or I don't know, something like uh, well, I think this probably gets back into the topic of the fire, but I've had some Catholics tell me, oh, it's not just pain of conscience and regret. There's another pain too. I mean, you even use the language primarily. So, what is there anything secondary that's worth mentioning as well?
Well, I think they're basically right about something there. I
Mm.
think we have to be very careful about hell because there's actually relatively little dogmatically defined. So we shouldn't impose our own views on things here. And I think particularly, if I can put it this way, sometimes people get confused about this retributive claim about hell. So that hell is punishment that is deserved, and it's good just because it's deserved. Some people talk about hell is necessary because it manifests God's justice. I have to be honest, these claims first are not in the doctrinal tradition. They're not defined. And as far as I know. And second, I think more importantly, they get it kind of backwards. I mean, I think manifesting God's justice makes sense, but the whole problem, if I can put it this way, with universalism, the way they're looking at things, is hell is unjust. Yeah, so just insisting that it manifests justice doesn't seem to make any sense as an answer, as a response. And it, in fact, I think that's the same thing with the pain of sense. So I think it's quite easy to understand the pain of sense in line with what I said, if you think the resurrection of the body is going to happen. And on our theory of the resurrection of the body, the classical doctrine is that there's this quality of the soul that's going to resemble Jesus. So you might remember in the Transfiguration, the divine light of God, the uncreated energies of God come flowing out of Jesus, right, on Mount Tabor. Um, The saints are going to reflect the light of God in their soul. And I think it's in their bodies, not just in their soul. Their soul reflects God's light, and it will somehow be shining out of their bodies. This is called clarity or brilliance. And I think it makes sense to think that the bodily state of the people who are damned, if there are any, is going to match that, the inverse. They're going to be, as it were, darkened. And I don't think it makes any difference to say there will be pain of sense, because I think that's like, you might say that's like a natural consequence
Yeah.
in the resurrected body of the despair and spiritual problem they're experiencing. So I think this is why the church has in its doctrinal claims, in the catechism, in recent teaching, has been very clear to sort of move away from that, because that's actually the thing we haven't defined, is, as I said, the fire and the pain of sense. That's the sort of stuff we're not clear on, and we don't need to be clear on. We don't know what the resurrected state will be like. We just know it in figure in the book of Revelation and Daniel, but we can very safely stay away from it, and we shouldn't read too much into it. Theological theories or private revelations. We should stick to what's doctrinally defined and try to make it as clear as possible. That's, I think, a good way to do theology on my side is I think you sort of stay away from making claims that are contrary to the tradition or biting off more than you need to chew.
Sure.
Right? So just stick to what we know, what's been defined.
Right. I mean, so you can do philosophical work, but within the confines of what is more clearly manifested in the tradition and in the magisterium. So you're not opposed to like doing philosophy and theology for these kinds of things, just in case someone
No, no.
misunderstands you.
Yeah, but I mean,
Mm.
here's an example. So I'm going to try to write a paper soon, or I should say the paper's written. I'm drafting, rewriting parts of it, submitting it on a free will defense for Thomists, and on these kind of attempts to give a reason, a sort of reason we might say why God allows hell, or how should we think about the fire of hell. You have to be very clear that you're offering something like a hypothesis
Yeah.
first.
Mhm.
And then, second, the point of these things is not to say what God's reasons actually are. So we don't really know what
Mhm.
God's reasons are, and we need to be very clear that we don't. In the tradition, there's a name for this: reasons of fittingness
Mhm.
versus demonstrations. So, very right at the beginning of my paper on this sort of stuff, I say, it's very clear. We have to be clear. This is reasons of fittingness. I don't know that this is the right answer, but the reason, it's also important when we think of the problem of evil. So, with the problem of evil, when you say something like this, the problem of evil is usually generated because you think God is all knowing, all loving, all powerful, and there's evil in the world. And you say, okay, some people have said there's a logical contradiction between these two states of affairs. And it gets pointed out there's only a logical contradiction if you think God's benevolence means he must eliminate all evil, period. Um, if you deny that, you substitute a principle there and say God's benevolence allows him to permit evil, merely permit it, in order to achieve some greater good. So as long as he has some good reason for allowing it, and we fill out what good reason means, he can allow evil. It's not incompatible with what God is for there to be evil in the world. But this is where a defense comes in, as opposed to the theodicy. In contemporary philosophy, we don't call it reasons of fittingness. We call it, in this case, a defense. And the point of a defense is not to say what God's reasons for allowing evil would be, those greater reasons, those good reasons, but to help show you that we might not know what God's reasons are. I think, in fact, we can kind of show logically, you can't rule out that God has some reason here. I mean, it doesn't make any
Sure.
sense to me
Mhm.
in the problem of evil to say we can know God wouldn't have any reason to allow evil. Well, why? I mean, like, how do you know that? Do you know God's reasons? Do you know God's mind? I find that very difficult to try to prove it, that any evil is pointless or can't have a purpose. But what you can try to do is show pick a really difficult evil, like the evil of hell, moral evil. This was Alvin Plantinga's move. And he says, here's what you can do. You can give a possible reason, a possible reason. This might not be God's real reason, but I'll just give you a possible reason that would outweigh, I'll tell you why God had to allow these kinds of evils in order to achieve this greater good. And it defeats those evils. It shows you that what God's going to achieve could possibly defeat these evils. And if you can show that that's possible, that's all you need to do, because now you've shown there's no contradiction between the existence of evil and God being all good and all loving and all those things. So that's sort of where I am, is I think the first thing I wanted to show in this article and the one about hell, the coherence of Christian hope, was just to sort of say, in general, there's a sort of deep problem in universalism. It's false. That leaves us with sort of, we can't show that there's a good reason God allowed hell. I don't know what that reason would be, but we can show it's possible that there's a hell, that some people persist in sin forever. And we can still be hopeful, I think. So you can sort of run the argument the other way around, the problem of evil the other way around. You say, well, as a Christian, I'm always much more certain, as a person of hope and faith, that God is all good, God's all powerful and all loving. So if there's something that happens in my life or the life of other people that looks like it's pointless evil, I don't need to offer any explanation for it. I can just stand back and say, I don't know what the reason is your child was miscarried. I don't know. And it's not my business to speak for God and say why that is. It's actually, I think, morally harmful to do that sometimes. But on the other hand, I can say, God is with us. God cares about us. And there's something good that can come out of this. So that's where I think Christian hope comes in, is the same thing with hell. I don't know, and I don't claim to know, if anybody actually is in hell. My claim in this piece here is merely that it's possible. I think it's important that you say for Christianity that it is possible. But I don't know what's going to happen. And my point about hope is something like this. If there are people in hell, we know God has a good reason for it. We don't know why, but like the moment we die and we find out there are people there, we'll know the reason. And we'll be able to see God's goodness in that. So I think this is an important point for us when we think about like church teaching about this. I mean, I think it's pretty clear this is church teaching. For Orthodox, for Catholics, it's the definitive teaching of the classical tradition for everybody. But I don't think you need to offer any reasons why hell exists. I think we can just say, well, we know that it's possible. And I don't know if anybody's there, but if they were, I can still trust that God's good and he'd have a good reason for it. And the reason is going to be good for the people in hell. They're not going to agree with that, but that's because they're broken. But I mean, God's going to have a good reason that's going to defeat all the evil. And I don't need to know what it is to trust him in that. So that's maybe a consideration that I think is important when we're thinking about hell.
Sure. So, Father, what is hard universalism, what your first article is arguing against?
Yeah, so to be quite clear, sometimes people use universalism in different ways. Mm-hmm. So the editor at Church Life Journal put these terms in my paper because people sometimes misinterpret them. So when I use this term universalism, I mean the real kind, which is hard universalism. So I just think of this as like, this is real universalism. Universalism, hard universalism, is the view that it is impossible that anybody could go to hell forever. So the way I put it is, it's necessarily true that all shall be saved. Necessarily true, could not be false. Whereas you have a different view that is not heretical, not problematic at all, which is soft universalism. Soft universalism holds that it is a contingent truth that all might be saved. So, for example, Jacques Maritain or Hans Urs von Balthasar, they talk about hope that all shall be saved. That's Hans Urs von Balthasar. Maritain had a different view, but both of them basically think it's a contingent fact. It might be the case that all go to heaven. It might not be the case. But whether it is or not is not open to us. We don't know which way. And we can hope that all people go to heaven as a contingent fact. I think this is perfectly orthodox. And this is basically, I would say, my view. I think it's fine to sort of, in one way, hope all people go to heaven, to pray that all people go to heaven. I think that's not a very serious problem. I should just add, though, as I was thinking as I'm saying this, when I say not all people are in hell, we don't know if anybody's in hell. Some people might get worried that we have doctrinal commitments on this. So the doctrinal commitments would be Satan and his angels being in hell. So I think that's probably true. I think that's doctrinal, that they're going to be separated from God forever. Some people might think it's scriptural Judas is in hell. I think the church actually hasn't defined that. So I think, again, good intellectual humility. I don't know. But so when I say I'm not sure anybody's in hell, I really mean people, human beings. So I think we probably should hold that Satan and his angels are going to be in hell. But hard universalism, the reason why it's even more, you might say, more heretical, famous conclusion that they draw from their view is that even Satan and his angels will be in heaven at the end. So that's an additional payoff you get from hard universalism, is it's necessarily true, could not be otherwise, that everyone is saved.
And that's why you just focus on showing that it's possible that that hell is possible, right? So the burden of proof is not you need to show that no, actually everyone going to heaven is impossible, right? That's not what you're doing. You just got to show it's possible that hell obtains. All right, that
Correct.
makes good sense. So, what would hard universalism need in order to be true? Okay, so we've defined the term. Now, what exactly are its propositions, its claims that it really needs? And what claims would it have to make about God and man?
Yeah. So in my article, I tried to focus on the most obvious implications and the obvious things that would need to make it true. So if it can't be otherwise, if it's impossible for anyone to be in hell, to be separated from God for eternity, something needs to make it true. And so the way I put it in my first article was pretty simple. There's only two possible terms here. Either God can't do anything else except save everybody, or human beings can't do anything else except love God and convert. Um, so what we mean by love God here, let me be very careful. I used a sort of basic term, love God. I mean the supernatural love of God, charity. Um, so that's going to be important here in a second. But let me just say, so what makes it true that everyone goes to heaven is either something on God's side or on our side. And some people get caught up in the question about freedom, because I put it as a sort of question about freedom at certain points, right? Our freedom to commit a mortal sin, that's possible for us, or God's freedom, for example, to create the world. So some people had, David Bentley Hart famously thinks God isn't free to create the world or not. He has to create the world. He necessarily doesn't. He cannot not create the world. He gets worried about, you must create the world or whatever, but I don't think it's very important. But there's a deeper problem behind universalism. So I put it as a claim about freedom, but it doesn't really need to be put as a claim about freedom. The problem is really the interaction between God and us, the relation between God and human beings. And this is what I said when I said right at the beginning, big time heresy, big classical heresies on the horizon. This is what I'm talking about. So what makes it true that God cannot do otherwise than save all is you have to think there's some sort of limit on what God can do. Now, there are only two kinds of logical limits on what God can do. There's a sort of limit that would be like God can't do things that are literally logically impossible. God can't make square circles. He can't, make the past not to have been, things that imply logical contradictions. And so what you get is if you say, well, it's like that, which I think is how some universalists are going to be bold enough to say, yes, it's just like that. God has to save people because it would be like a logical contradiction if he didn't. What that implies is God cannot but save all because God can't be God without us. Um, to me, that's big ball heresy, right? That's big time World Series heresy. The second one is, I think, sort of just as bad. So the other way, God can't do anything but save all, is going to be a limitation that we call suppositional necessity. So this is like, for example, God cannot make the past not to have been. So God can, right, he can have changed things so that the past never occurred. But given that the past has happened, God can't undo it because he's already, set up the world that way. It doesn't make any sense,
Sure.
given what God wanted, for him to change it. So we call these kind of suppositional necessities. So the second way you can think God can't do anything but save us is you think God can't create human beings except in a state of grace. Necessarily, human beings are by their essence in a state of grace. Now, I put this as a claim in my first paper that the way they argue for this, in the way David Bentley Hart argued for it in his book, was to argue this classical old fundamental option theory that like mortal sin is impossible. Mortal sin is impossible. What I didn't highlight is that the deep problem with that is it says something like the love of God is natural to us. The supernatural love of God is a natural part of what human beings are. And in David Bentley Hart's new book, You Are Gods, he just says that flat out. He says God couldn't create us without grace. It's natural to us to become God. Again, this is World Series baseball heresy. This is big time heresy. So that's the problem. The third kind of logical limit I can get back to again, but it's going to be a version of this suppositional necessity where somebody will say something like this: God can't allow the possibility of mortal sin persisting forever because God has to do something to defeat it. God wouldn't be good, he wouldn't be just if he didn't defeat the mortal sin, the evil that he permits. Now, this kind of answer is kind of close to the right answer, I think. So maybe I can come back to that later. But
Okay.
I just think that that's like the right answer. But it doesn't mean universalism is true. It just means God has to do something to fix the possibility of mortal sin. But we already know God has done something. He died on the cross, right? So I think, in fact, we know that. We don't know what the end times are going to look like, but we do know, I think, that whatever is going to happen is going to defeat the sin that exists now and the possibility of mortal sin. But classical Christian doctrine doesn't think that defeat at the end times is going to mean everybody goes to hell.
Mm.
So I think you can give an account where it makes sense to say evil is defeated even if everyone's not in heaven. But I'll come back to saying why I don't think you can show that defeat of evil at the end times must require everyone going to heaven. I think that's where you're going to get in trouble. What you're saying is God can't have any reasons to allow hell.
Mm.
But I don't see how you can know that, as I said earlier.
Sure. I guess this kind of goes into my next question, but when you talk about, how the universalists are kind of saying that God can't do otherwise, right? But I mean, aren't there certain things that we want to say God could not have done otherwise on? I mean, to give an example, right? I wouldn't want it to be the case, perhaps, that God would possibly command, right? Let's say the Israelites to go into a village and just rape everybody and then dismember them and then leave them there, right? I mean, and that's it, right? I mean, that seems like something that would be inconsistent with the divine nature, that would not have any good reason whatsoever. And so, wouldn't I want to say that's a limit? limit on God?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. So I think something like this, you have to be careful when you say what God can command, because there are some things that I think it makes sense for God to command that look maybe bad from our angle. So I mean, I think, for example, in the Old Testament, you have cases where uh, God is going to command capital punishment for certain things. Now, I think you're right, though. He can't command capital punishment for things that are not immoral. Um, I think that, as you put it, would be a limit on the divine nature. So yes, this is my view too. Is I'm going to say God can't command things that are morally evil. He can't command things that are morally evil. Now, where does that limit come from? So I've given basically um, three limits, three different kinds of limits on the divine nature in what I said earlier. I said there are logical limits in what God can do, and there are suppositional limits on what God can do. And I think this is a case of a suppositional limit, we might say, because when God commands you to do something morally evil, it would be as if He set up the world so that certain things are morally right and certain things morally wrong, and then He sort of changes His mind. I think that doesn't make any sense because God is the author of all being. So, of course, if He set up the world a certain way, He's going to be consistent. So he's not going to command us to do things that are intrinsically morally evil. But as I said, there might be cases where he commands us to do things that people today would think are unjustified. For example, the capital punishment cases in the Old Testament or waging war. But I think in those cases, we have to be careful in reading them, of course. But I think basically what's happening is sort of God imposing capital punishment for a serious crime. And I think you'd have to qualify it to think of the case at the time, what's going on in the time. Um, I'll give you one more example: Abraham and Isaac, the binding of Isaac. So actually, I think you can interpret this one of two ways. I think you can interpret it as God is asking him to do something that is maybe God allowed himself to be misinterpreted. So he actually tells Abraham, offer your son Isaac. He says offer, I think. And some of the rabbis, I think, point out that it doesn't say kill.
Yeah.
And so I like this interpretation because it's God allows Abraham to misinterpret him as a prophecy and then stops him. Uh, you might say something else. You might say God did want him to offer Isaac, uh, but he was going to stop him somehow, right? So St. Paul says in Hebrews that Abraham didn't know what was going to happen, but he believed in the resurrection of the dead, that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. Uh, this is a case where God has already promised Abraham that his children, his descendants, will come through Isaac. And so Abraham has hope, has faith in God, that God will be faithful to his promises. So I think that's a good mix you see in the picture of you have hope and faith. God is good. God knows what's going on. I don't know exactly what he's commanding me to do here. But I know that what's going to happen is fine in the end. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to play out. But I think in this case, you have a case of trust in God that makes sense.
Okay, so then I think what the universalists would say is, okay, Father James Dominic, I mean, this is my position that I'm saying there is a limit, right, on God's moral nature or, from his moral nature on what he could permit, especially, I mean, I think some people would even say that hell is morally evil itself. So I want to make sure that we're also representing universalists fairly. So how, I mean, to kind of use the three limits that you explained before, where would this fall under all of that? Or, I mean, I think this is what you are tackling. The question is hell morally evil or impossible, basically.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways to interpret that.
Yeah,
So the way to understand hell, as I've mentioned to some other people, is as a case of what we call double effect reasoning in
sure.
morality. So if you look at the conditions for the doctrine of double effect, this is a view of in ethics about how to permit you have an action that brings about a good and an evil effect. So there are many cases where this happens, like in self-defense, um, warfare. There are cases where we perform an action and it results in a good and a bad effect. And um, when you're making a moral decision about whether to do such an action, we want to be careful we're not utilitarians. So utilitarians say there's no difference between intending and permitting. All that matter morally are the consequences, not your intention. So clearly, I'm going to say the doctrine of hell is not the means don't matter and that God can inflict pain and suffering on people. I've already denied that God is doing that. So I think the means involved in what God is doing are going to be good or morally neutral, which is like in the case of double effect. The means you use to bring about some good and evil effect are themselves good or morally neutral. So I think that holds for hell. What happens in hell, the reason hell exists is God permits people to sin and to remain in sin. And then what he does, I think, with sort of the pain of sense things, is God repairs people somehow. He repairs their physical nature in the resurrection of the dead. He gives them various kinds of grace and things so that their powers of their soul and their body are restored, but it causes them pain accidentally. So in that case, there's an evil effect, but it happens accidentally. It's not the action God is doing is not inflicting pain and torment on people.
Right.
And then what you have to ask is whether God's. So then what you want to ask is after this the other logical limit, which is, does God have a good reason for it? Is there some greater good that's going to come out of this? And I think you're right to demand to say something like God has to have a reason for it that's going to be good and is going to be a greater good than what he permits. This is in fact part of doctrine of double effect too. So you can only permit an evil effect when you have a reasonable hope of securing a good effect by means of the action that's going to inevitably produce the evil effect, where the good effect proportionally outweighs the evil effect. This is the basic, and you only intend the good effect. This is the classic doctrine of double effect for things like collateral damage in warfare. You're bombing a factory, you're trying to end the war, you try to minimize civilian casualties. You know you're gonna cause some, but you're not on a terror campaign to terrorize the civilians. You're not bombing school children. I think a similar case holds here for hell. Is we want to say there's some greater good that comes out of it, and I'm going to be even more specific. I can't justify all this for you right now, but I'll be a little bit more specific. I think that good that comes out at the end should also be good for the people in hell. So that we could say those people who are in hell are better off than they would be if they weren't. If God had not done this thing, those people would be worse off. So I think this is what I mean by defeating the evil. It has to be good for the people who suffer the evil. So this is a traditional sort of condition people have pointed out for the problem of evil. I'm just applying it to the people in hell. I think what God does in hell, permitting it, and what he might do with, as I called, the fire, is I think God has to be doing good for the people in hell. So that's where I end on this, is I say, I don't see any reason to believe that if God fulfilled all those conditions, it looks possible to me. It looks possible to me that people could be in hell and God defeats it for even the people there. Even though they continue to suffer from their own sins, it's nothing God is doing to them that causes them to suffer except accidentally. And God is achieving greater goods for everybody as a result, including the people in hell.
All right, to my next question. So David Bentley Hart, or as we've called him, DBH, famous Eastern Orthodox theologian, philosopher, He argues that the concept of mortal sin is incoherent because no one in sound mind can perform a mortal sin and be deemed culpable. So, what are your thoughts on this argument that everybody basically has a universal insanity defense?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's pretty wrong for a lot of different reasons. I mean, it looks like Hart is going to begin with a conception on which freedom is choosing on the basis of reasons. And I mean, I think that's basically right. To act freely is to act rationally. So a free person can't act merely arbitrarily for no reason. That'd be a contradiction in terms. I agree. Um, so there's a certain way in which, right, the extent to which you lack knowledge of what you're doing or in control of what you're doing, you're not free and not responsible. So that's all true, I basically think. That's correct. The problem is the next step. So Hart basically says something like this: the only thing we have reason to do is love God, who's the good itself. So if you're acting on reasons, the ultimate reason for action is happiness, and God is the source of all happiness and good. So you could only possibly reject God and choose something other than God, as in mortal sin, if you act irrationally.
Hmm.
If you act irrationally. Now, the problem here, Hart thinks, is that it looks like there's a contradiction. So to see, this is a quote from his book, that all shall be saved. To see the good and know it truly is to desire it insatiably, to obey it unconditionally, while not to desire it is not to have known it truly, and so never to have been free to choose it. End quote. So the point is, mortal sin is impossible. You can't freely and knowingly reject God. So there's no possibility of mortal sins and no possibility of hell. So these claims, though, are unsound. DBH has made a logical jump there. The reason is we act for the good generically. We don't act out of love of God, supernatural love of God, in everything we do. That's what he's implying. Um, and of course, if you necessarily loved God, you can't sin, right? That would be impossible. If you're like the people in heaven and you just love God necessarily, then of course you couldn't commit a mortal sin. But that's not natural to us. That's not part of what it is to be human, is to act out of supernatural love of God. We act for the generic desire for our good, to do what's right, to do what's good in that sense, for happiness. But that doesn't require loving God specifically. So different people have different conceptions of what will make them happy, and they can be wrong about that. So while it's true that freedom is not acting for no reason, mortal sin doesn't require acting that way. Instead, we only need to say that not every reason that looks to you to be a good reason is in fact a good reason. You can act upon what seems to be a good reason for you while simultaneously being responsible for those decisions, because you acted on what was in fact a bad reason. So here's the difference. It just turns out people can often know better. They don't just act from pure mistakes. They act often from culpable negligence. So culpable negligence is basically where you could have known better. You could have known that what you were doing you should not be doing, but you did it anyway. And usually that's a kind of lack of concern, lack of care that leads you that way. Um, but before we get into that, let me just say a little bit deeper problem with this claim mortal sin is incoherent. I mentioned it earlier with the World Series baseball heresy. Is, I mean, you've got sort of two problems here that are connected to these metaphysical logical claims. God, to be God, had to create us. Um, it looks like on that fork, what you're saying is pantheism is true. We're somehow products, necessary products of God's nature. That's a pretty serious thing. And David Bentley Hart believes that in his new book. He says we're sort of necessary results of the intradivine Trinitarian persons, right? We're manifestations or activities essential to God's triune nature, something like that. And I think if you say that, you're way out of the ballpark. That kind of thing is really serious. But this other claim about mortal sin being impossible also is very serious because it's sort of the inverse of that. It says that we are naturally, but necessarily by nature, loving God supernaturally, which is to say something like, by nature, we're gods. Grace is not grace. Grace is something intrinsically natural to human beings. So this is very, very silly, I think, because we have in First Corinthians, what have we that we have not received? That's a truth about being. Anything that has being, insofar as it has being, depends on God. And if we were deserving of being partakers in the divine nature, merely given what we are as human beings by our natural essence, that would imply we're naturally divine. It's the same error both ways. So if it were literally naturally impossible for us to commit a mortal sin, it's going to have us somehow mixed up with God's being somehow. This was the famous Pelagian heresy. The Pelagian heresy said God's act of creating us was all the grace we need to do what's necessary for salvation. That's what this claim that mortal sin is incoherent gets you, is the Pelagian heresy, that I can earn salvation by my own deeds because I'm just a part of God or something. So I think that's very serious, because obviously if you think the Pelagian heresy is true, it doesn't make much sense to me why we need the cross or something, right? Because if we're by nature capable of salvation, why do we baptize babies? Why do we, this was Augustine's problem. Why do we baptize babies? Why do we need the cross? Original sin seems to just affect us by giving us a bad example, and Jesus is just here to give us a good example, but it doesn't do anything that we really need for salvation, and that's exactly why it's heretical. It looks like it just makes Christianity crazy, right? Why do we believe God died on the cross then? If it doesn't, we don't need that for anything. So that's why I think these claims about mortal sin are much more serious than they appear.
Yeah, and I appreciate how you mentioned that, the position that, like God must necessarily create us, right? Or else, he wouldn't be God. Some universalists might say, well, that's not my position, right? But you're explaining that's DBH's position. And even the position you just outlined of kind of Pelagianism coming back. I know universalists who openly defend Pelagius and say like, oh, well, he didn't get a fair rap, and try to defend him again or somehow. And so I'm just like, no, everything you're saying, like maybe a universalist has his or her particular way of going about how they defend the position. But I think, you're pointing out things that universalists have actually said and how they logically follow, at least from, at least the models that we have on the table right now of
Yeah,
universalism.
so I mean, I think if I can put it that way, I think a lot of people get into the view without thinking through the logical
Yeah.
implications of it. But if you accept these kinds of claims that we are like, God would be unjust to us by not raising us to the divine nature or something like that. I mean, what you're implying is by natural justice, by what we are, God has to raise us to his own life. And now what you're embracing is Pelagianism. So, and Pelagianism is the same thing. It mixes the divine and human nature together. So this is what I mean, is a lot of these views are actually tied together.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one that I think, the only version of universalism that doesn't go there is the one that says God can't have a good reason
I see.
for allowing more moral evil to persist forever. But I mean, I think that's the weakest version, because it turns out you can't prove it. So in talking with universalists, they just end with what they call, this is David Bentley Hart's moral argument, right? If God allowed it, he'd just be a horrible person. I just have a moral intuition. And it's not an argument, it's a moral intuition,
Right.
that there is no point to allowing mortal sin to persist forever. There's no possible good that could come from it. I don't need to prove it to you. You're a bad person if you think that could be the case. And I just say, I don't know what God's reasons are. I mean, I find it really, really hard to say that like, if you think that could be true for hell, I mean, it seems like you could think that's true for lots of things. I mean, there are really bad moral evils that have happened in history that are not hell, but are really, really bad. And I don't pretend to have an explanation for them. You know, the Holocaust is really bad. I went to Auschwitz and Dachau a couple summers ago, and I mean, I cried like a baby. I can't start telling you stories about it. I tell them for my ethics students sometimes, but I mean, I think that's really serious, really, really serious evil. And you know, I don't think we should go around saying there's this kind of evil is pointless. We can never know why God would allow it, because it looks to me like there are lots of those cases that are at least possibly pointless. I mean, and if you don't, I mean, if you just start ruling out things and say we know God couldn't allow this, I just have a moral intuition. Well, I mean, it looks like there are lots of those things you could have those moral intuitions about, and they don't look reliable to me. What my moral intuitions are about what God could and could not allow. Uh, I think we don't know why God allows things, but I'm much more confident that God exists than that any particular instance of moral evil is pointless. So, I mean, I guess that's just, I sort of end with a sort of agnosticism, a kind of skeptical theism about
Yeah.
some of this, which is, uh, I just don't think there's any good grounds in the end for saying, as the Universalists do in this kind of weak version, I just have a moral intuition. Well, I mean, I have much more than a moral intuition. I think, you know, we have good confidence God exists, and I have very good confidence in the Christian tradition. So if the Christian tradition says that these things are possible, I just, you know, I mean, I have good evidence for believing that. I don't have great evidence for believing my moral intuitions are always accurate. I mean, I sin all the time, I make mistakes. Um, but the way I put it is something like this. Um, you know, I think in the end they're kind of right. There's something like it doesn't come down to arguments in the end. It doesn't come down to arguments in the end. And I think there's something true about that part. But I think in the end, it's really an invitation to trust God. I think it's, I mean, I think that's why God didn't tell us. I think it's the same reason why he didn't tell me I'm going to heaven. This is what I put in my Hell and the Coherence of Christian Hope, is I think it comes down to the same thing. God didn't tell us if anybody's in hell because we don't need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not good for us to know who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. Uh, I think that's perfectly reasonable that God doesn't tell us we're going to heaven so that we can trust him. So that we can trust him. That's what's important, because I think we get mixed up by thinking of heaven and hell as these exterior, extrinsic punishments, where in fact, heaven and hell are just our delight in God, trusting in God for his own sake. So I'm very encouraged, I'll put it bluntly, I'm very encouraged by a lot of Catholic saints who have said things like this. I would rather suffer the punishments of hell for eternity than be separated from God.
Mm.
If I was able to be together with God, I would be willing voluntarily to suffer the torments of hell for eternity. There are lots of saints who've said that. I think it makes perfect sense because, from a Christian point of view, this is just the theology of the cross. What we're aiming for is God himself, for his own sake, not for the kind of joy or pleasure he causes me, but for his own sake. And that's why many of the saints have suffered these dark nights of the soul, is to purify their intention. They suffer the pains of purgatory and hell in this life to purify them so that they love God for his own sake. I think that makes good sense to me. And I think that's why God doesn't tell us these things, because our reward in the next life is him. It's him, nothing else. That's it. And if you're not prepared for that in this life, then it's going to be not a happy time. But it's not because there's pain going on exteriorly. We're not just in it for that kind of thing. But even if there was pain, I'd be happy as long as I was with God. I can understand that from the Christian point of view.
I like to make a comment and then move on to my next question. And this next question should be fairly like easy to deal with. But I like how you've been connecting the problem of evil with universalism, because I think in some of my past debates with universalists are like, why are you bringing the problem of evil in? if anything, like hell makes a problem of evil worse or something like that, right? But I think you're drawing a really good analogy here because you're saying it's like a reverse logical problem of evil, where it's like, for the atheists, they're saying it's logically impossible that God and evil could coexist, whereas and then the universalists are saying it's logically impossible that hell and God could coexist, and you're simply showing, well, here's a possibility proof, to use, I think, Plantinga's term. So
Yeah.
you mentioned the concept of culpable negligence, right? And I think you already touched on this a little bit, but I think it's just worth mentioning again because some, some people might say, well, no, like, I mean, if there's negligence, then it's not really your fault, right? I mean, like, we make mistakes, we don't calculate things, maybe, I don't know, a construction worker shows up tired, right? And he accidentally drops something on someone, they die. What negligence could be culpable?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious we have culpable negligence all the time that we evaluate in courts of law and police stations. If you go drinking and driving and hit a pedestrian, you're culpable for that. So, because it's predictable that driving when drunk is going to hurt somebody. So if you just don't care, I mean, this is what happens, right? People just don't care. Well, that's morally culpable. Why? Because you could have known, you could have cared. It wasn't out of your control. It wasn't just like somebody slipped you a sleeping pill before you got into the car. I have a friend who's just now suffering from a brain injury, and he was driving and he couldn't see for a minute. He had to pull over. Um, Now, I mean, if that happened to you and you hit somebody, that's not your fault, right? It just happened out of the blue. But I mean, drinking and driving is obviously a case where you can know what the consequences are, and that's why we treat it differently in the court of law, right? If my friend hit somebody because he couldn't see from a medical condition, he had a seizure or something, right? I mean, nobody's going to think that's voluntary or that's something you could have taken care of. It's something you could not have done otherwise, right? Something that wasn't in your control. Whereas drinking and driving is in your control. You could have done otherwise in that case. So this is where we just think what ignorance is doing. Is it making it that it could not have been otherwise, or is it could have been otherwise? If it really could have been otherwise and it was in my control, then it is something that I can be culpable for to the extent it was in my control. So I'll say the basic mistake Hart and people that like this response are making is they're pulling out that dead, condemned 1970s Catholic moral theology handbook by people like, what's his name? Fuchs, I'm forgetting his name. But the theologians in the 1970s like to propose nobody can fulfill all three conditions for mortal sin: deliberate intent, grave matter, and full knowledge. Because nobody can really fully know that their actions are wrong. Nobody is culpable enough to commit a mortal sin. Now, this thing in the 1970s was called fundamental option theory, where everybody, the age of reason, makes a fundamental choice against or for God, and they're in a state of grace, basically, from the moment they make this fundamental choice. And even though you might do something that's materially grave matter, you really don't mean it. So you might have adultery with somebody, you might fornicate, but really, that's not my true self. That doesn't define me. So my sins don't really define me. So who can say that those things were really mortal sins? So I don't really need to go to confession. Well, John Paul II, thanks be to God, wrote Veritatis Splendor. And if you go look at 65 to 70 in that document, it condemns this view for good reason. Here's why. When you commit a mortal sin, what they're mixed up on is what the full knowledge is about. So deliberate intent and grave matter look more reasonable. You just have to intend to do something. And you have to know that it has to be something that's really seriously wrong, objectively speaking. That's grave matter. And then third, you don't even need to know how wrong the sin is, right? You don't need to have full knowledge of God's essence in order to commit a sin. That's crazy. Nobody has ever thought that. What you need is simply knowledge of what you're doing, just like I just said, right? The sort of knowledge that makes your action could not have been otherwise is what undermines full knowledge. So if I thought, I was drinking Pepsi
Yeah.
and it turned out somebody slipped a roofie into my Pepsi when I'm driving, and I'm drinking the Pepsi and I pass out, right? I haven't done anything wrong because I didn't know there was a roofie in the drink. I didn't have full knowledge of what I was doing. But if you commit an act of omission, acts of omission where you fail to do something, that's like the drinking and driving case. You just get into the car even though you're drunk and drive away. Uh, you're just not attending to certain things. That's what it is to commit the sin, is you don't care about the possibility of hitting and killing somebody. That's what makes it wrong. So we just should be very careful to interpret these conditions clearly. Elizabeth Anscombe has a very good paper on this called Sin. And she said, Alphonsus Liguori should have never used this term full knowledge. She was attacking all these people like this Joseph Fuchs. And she said, he should never have used that term because all these people were just going to misinterpret it. But she gives a very good explanation that, it's true. All our actions and knowledge are limited. Decisions we make are fallible, less than fully informed, less than aware on many cases. But responsibility doesn't depend on that. I mean, that's simply the case. Responsibility doesn't depend on having full knowledge of the universe, God's omniscience, or being fully engaged consciously. Sometimes we engage in intentional activities out of habits. Those habits can still be bad, and they can be intentionally formed. I'm acting out of character when I'm doing something wrong. So something can be wrong precisely because you did something without trying to find out, without doing anything. That's precisely what makes it wrong. So as I've put it, I have an example, from our recent controversial history in the US with police. So, there are all these controversies, of course, and fights in the Black Lives Matter about police getting in trouble for what they've done to civilians, and kneeling on someone's neck to restrain them, and you severely injure or suffocate a civilian. It doesn't matter, we might say, what that person did. It looks like that's negligence, the way they're restraining them. Why? Because it's perfectly obvious to anybody that you don't need full knowledge of how evil it is to suffocate somebody. It looks like putting your knee on somebody's neck is a really dangerous thing to do, that you're probably going to severely hurt somebody if you keep doing that. That's the kind of thing we're talking about when we say culpable negligence. You're in a very dangerous situation and you just don't care. So that policeman who did those things, right, wouldn't be given a more lenient sentence in court if he said, oh, I didn't know that this person was going to die. I didn't know that they had breathing or heart problems. I wasn't really paying attention when they stopped breathing. If he told that to the judge would give him more time in prison, not less, right? Because they point out, right, he was culpable. He was negligent and culpable for it. He could have done other things, and he just didn't pay attention. That's what was wrong.
Right. In other words, I mean, in ordinary moral discourse, we acknowledge and recognize that there is such a thing as culpable negligence. And so, at least it seems, given everything else you've said in tandem with it, right, it seems really kind of, I don't know how to put it, but unlikely, implausible that we wouldn't have culpable negligence with mortal sin, even if, like, just in everyday moral discourse, even just with grave evils that we can do, we can talk about culpable negligence. And so why would we get a free pass with God on the issue of our eternal fate, if you will, on the character of our
Well,
souls?
if I can put it bluntly, though, I think that's part of the problem here, is
Yeah.
divorcing these two questions, treating them as if they're somehow different. I mean, I think, like, this is how you lose God's grace, is you can't love God and hate your neighbor, right? So God's grace isn't just some magical thing added on top. People say that, right? How could God punish people for eternity for doing these finite things? Well, I mean, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. Is not like a conscious decision to reject God, the good itself, right? What we're talking about is people who love what's evil.
Mm.
They love something else that's not God. And I don't need to know what God is like in himself in order to love something that's not God. It's loving the thing that's not God, not caring about people around me, caring about myself more than other people. I can do that perfectly fine without knowing what God is. And in fact, that's sort of the problem is God has made himself known to me in some way, right? There's a chance that I could have discovered what real goodness was like, and it was there in the wings, but I didn't even look into it. I don't care what God is like. I care more about myself. That's the sort of moral decision making that goes wrong. And it's not different from the sort of ordinary moral decision making we make. It's not like you have to make a special decision whether you're going to go to heaven and another decision whether I'm going to kill somebody. I mean, they're not two separate decisions. Um, so I think that's a large part of the problem here is people think forming my character, doing the normal things in my life are somehow not going to affect. They're somehow two different categories. Um, where I think it's just it takes work, if I can put it that way. It takes work and it takes grace to love God. Um, our default position after original sin is that we don't love Him, and we're going to persist in doing evil unless we change. So I think it's relatively easy to stay in mortal sin and not care because we're not born caring. It's just like other kinds of moral evil in our life. We're not born caring for other people around us. You know, kids, I worked with daycare when I was a seminarian. I worked with kindergartners and first graders on Capitol Hill, St. Joseph's Church, or St. Peter's on Capitol Hill. And uh, there, you know, the kids, when they're little, they don't want to share, right? They're not born wanting to share. So you've got to kind of break up fights over toys and that kind of thing and get them in order. That's an example of what I mean, right? We need help from other people already to be good moral agents. We need people to tell us what's right and wrong and what's in our interest because we make mistakes all the time because we don't care. So that's the second part is we also need help to live a good life from things like the law in government because a lot of people wouldn't care if they didn't have punishments and law because that's something wrong with us. And it's the same thing with sin, right? These things are sins when you don't share with people. I mean, that's what we're talking about when we say sin. We're just talking about ordinary garden variety moral evil. And those acts are acts by which you love evil. You don't love what's good. And God is the good itself. So if you make these decisions to love something that's not God, that's what gets you to hell. It's not like making a conscious decision to reject God. That's not necessary. Not even necessary.
Right. Yeah, our ordinary moral evil has consequences for our soul and for our salvation. They're not two separate questions. I think that's a really good point to nail down. So I'm going to ask this next question about, so I'm going to ask this next question, but then I'm going to start kind of, for the sake of time, maybe jumping through some of the other ones, if that's okay with you, Father, because I
Yeah.
know I'm sure it's getting late over where you are. So yeah, and I'll let you know where I'm going after this, and then you can, if I
Okay.
if I
Okay.
missed anything, yeah. So in your paper, the first article, I should say, you discussed also what three truths can logically get you to the possibility of hell, and I think it's really important to highlight this part. So, what are they, and why believe them?
Yeah. So in the paper, I'm going to rephrase them to be a little bit more simple.
Mhm.
I put them in the paper in sort of ordinary language. In the paper, they were people can want things that don't correspond to what they ought to want. Learning new facts about the world or God or yourself need not change what you want, and God doesn't need to change what you want. Here's a slightly different way to put them. One, you can sin mortally. Two, knowing facts about the world or God or yourself does not necessarily stop you from committing mortal sins. And three, God doesn't necessarily need to prevent you from sinning mortally. That is, you don't deserve God's grace to prevent you from persisting in sin. So I think those 3 points are all you need to get you hell. Because as I said, hell is just persisting in mortal sin forever. So you need to be able to commit a mortal sin. It needs to be the case that as you go on, nothing outside of you, knowing no new fact is going to make you love God, right? Move from mortal sin to not mortal sin. No mere act of knowing facts is going to do that. And then God doesn't have to do anything. He can leave you like that. So I think if these 3 points are true, you have the possibility of hell. And I think those truths are true. So universalists typically object to all three.
Yeah.
But I would say the first two truths follow from a simple account of moral responsibility. People are responsible agents. They can love things that they're not supposed to love. There you go, right? And I think because people are free, truth two follows. Because we simply wouldn't have been responsible for our actions if I could not have done otherwise at all. I think it's just not an object of free choice. So if I was just operating under my facts, right? My facts just make me do things. The facts I know, my knowledge about the world, I think it's pretty clear I'm not really in control somehow. If I can't control the sorts of things I know or whatever, right? So I think that 1 and 2 are just going to follow from a simple account of that. So I think 3 is a little harder, but I think 3 follows pretty simply from the fact Pelagianism is wrong. So we're partakers of the divine nature. It's not something natural to us. And so we don't do it by nature after after original sin. So I'll just add one more sort of basic claim that gets you all 3 of these just from theology. I was sort of referring to philosophy, but the 3 claims all follow from the doctrine of original sin. That's it. You get all 3 of them from original sin. God sets people up with grace in the Garden of Eden. They had all knowledge, right? All knowledge of good and evil necessary to make a good decision to obey God. But nevertheless, they committed a sin. God didn't stop them. Nothing they knew prevented them from committing the sin, even though they had good knowledge. We can do the same thing with Satan. Satan was in the same situation. So on either of the view of the angelic sin or the original sin, 1, 2, and 3 are true. God doesn't need to stop them, prevent them from committing original sin. He's not necessarily going to do that. And no fact they know prevented them from committing a sin, and mortal sin was possible. It really lost them grace. They didn't love God after they committed the sin. They had to be restored to the garden after that. So that's how I think you get 1, 2, and 3 just straight out of theology. Anti-Pelagian Orthodox theology gets it 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, man, okay, so I know that we've been going on for a while. I want to ask some questions here, but I think maybe we'll do a part 2 or something like that with you, Father, just to get your ideas. Just get the groundwork done first, and then we'll get into some of the other issues that we didn't touch on the interview script. So I'm going to jump now to what is number 10 on my on the sheet, and it's just look. I mean, Father James, okay, Dominic, I hear what you're saying, okay, but dude, how do we make it look like, or how do we avoid making it look like God has just set up some people to be damned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just, I don't know how to say it, but it just looks to me like it's false. So I should think we should just insist God made us free. God made us free. It's dogmatic in Catholicism that God denies nobody what they need to be saved. Their resistance to God's grace is entirely their fault. This is a dogmatic commitment that God gives sufficient grace to all people. He desires that all men be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. And for those of you who are playing the Thomistic home game, Aquinas says exactly this in Summa Contra Gentiles 3, Caput 159. He says, it's like the sun shining on people. God shines the sunlight on everybody, and the only reason some people are damned is because they shut their eyes. So I think God doesn't set us up to fail. God doesn't set us up to fail. So I think he doesn't eliminate evil. He merely permits that it happen. So he doesn't cause it in any way that we sin. He just has allowed it to happen. So he created us free in this case. And he didn't confirm us in grace from the first moment of our existence. He allowed the fall to happen. That's the world he decided to create. So I think we can't control why God did that. That happened. That's the world. He's free and he has his reasons. There's a way in which that answer appears unsatisfying, but I don't think it should be. I think we just have a virtue of trust, a hope that God is good. And, it's a spiritual trial to trust God when the evidence seems contrary to what appears to me to be the case. But that's the story of heroes in the Bible. So, in the end, I think we shouldn't try to and don't need to find out God's reasons for evil. And it can often be even spiritually dangerous to try to do so. But I think maybe this is part two, is I think the way you want to avoid that conclusion that God has set us up to fail, I think does require saying a little bit more than this to help people see it.
Sure.
So I think you need to try to give those sort of fitting reasons, right? You need to be able to give some sort of case why God allows moral evil and maybe even hell. What good does that accomplish? Could there be any good we could think of? Well, I'll give you a hint. Maybe this is for part two. Is read Athanasius's On the Incarnation. That's how he sets up the book, as he says, this is what happened. God let the problem of evil happen. He allowed moral evil to happen so that he could fix it, so that he could win for us so great a Redeemer. It just turns out that that's the solution to the problem of evil is Christianity. That's why God became incarnate, was to resolve the problem of moral evil, of why God allowed moral evil to occur, is because if he confirmed us in grace, Athanasius says, from the first moment of our creation, maybe he wouldn't have given us such great goods. There are certain goods that we can only have if God allowed the fall to happen and allowed the possibility of moral evil to be real. So God could have predestined everybody to go right to heaven. So I'm a Thomist. We have this theory, Bonesianism, right? I think God could have set up the world to predestine everybody and they'd do it freely. He could have set up everyone like the Blessed Virgin Mary. From the first moment of their conception, they would have gone right to heaven, never commit a sin. But he didn't do that. And the fact he didn't do that doesn't mean that this world that he created is worse, or even that it is the things he allows here are not going to be defeated by God, even though there's some other world where those evils never needed to happen. So I think in this world, some good he can get out of these evils that he couldn't get in another world. So maybe there are other better worlds God could have created. I think God can create lots of better worlds than ours. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that in this world, the evils that exist in this world, God won't abundantly defeat in the end. So even if there's another world where there's better things that happen, I think in this world, Athanasius' story makes sense. God allowed the fall and allowed moral evil so he could send Jesus to save us. And when Jesus comes to save us, we have a special relationship with God. We have a relationship with a God who suffered death for us. God would not have had to suffer death for us in another world where sin didn't happen. So the Franciscans sometimes think Jesus would have become incarnate as man in any world God created. I like the Dominican position on this, but here's part of why. I mean, I think you shouldn't say we don't know. I think you should just be agnostic. This is what Thomas does. He says, I don't know if God created another world, if Jesus would become incarnate there. But he says, here's what we do know. We know that in this world, this is why God allowed sin, is so that he could fix it with Jesus. And by becoming incarnate as Jesus and setting up the world that way, he won for us even better things than we had in the Garden of Eden. There's certain graces in this world that you can't have in any other. If there was no sin, there wouldn't be the goods that God's going to give us in this world. So I think that's the outline of where you go with the problem of evil, is you say Christianity is the answer.
And I think I just want to add here too, or kind of, in addition to what you've been saying, right, or to complement it rather. I mean, when you see also, some people might say, oh, well, so just so that we could get Jesus, well, thanks God. And it's like, no, 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 you're missing the point. Like, if you don't know how wonderful it is to have Christ, and to have him in your life, to have known that, to have him walk the earth, to know who he is, um, then it wouldn't be right to just say, okay, well, thanks God, we just got Jesus, I guess, and you allowed evil for. No, it's like, it's kind of worth it if in the end we could get the Lord, what I'm saying. And so that's why I kind of really love the answers that you gave. Okay, so I want to jump to the analogy that you used at the end of your article about the suicidal loved one. And they're kind of on the edge and you're holding on to them, and you're using this as an analogy to kind of explain how, I guess, and I might be crunching some questions together here, but how holding on to them shows how even God's love can reign victorious in hell. So can you explain the analogy and what's going on here?
Yeah, so let me tie it to what we just said.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, you can think that Jesus became man. That's good, great by itself. But I think that misses part of the point. Um, Part of the point is this: Jesus's death and resurrection is the beginning of our resurrection. So I said, Jesus in this world becoming incarnate is winning for us goods that defeat evil for everybody. I mentioned earlier, I think hell is actually the hell in this world is even better than if God had let people just be on their own
Right.
after death. People sin and just let them go. I think in this way, hell is even better than annihilationism. If God just like poofed people out of existence. I think there's something beautiful, just like in this. That's what I used with this analogy of the suicidal loved one. Somebody thinks they don't matter. They're going to kill themselves, right? I used the analogy here out in heaven, Mount Zion, right? People want to jump off the cliff and eliminate themselves. Eliminate themselves. And I said, what loving person wouldn't try to save them? Uh, I think you get a picture of what it is that God's going to do at the end of time through Christ. This is what to preview a little bit, Maximus the Confessor says, is in Christ, all of us are going to be transformed by him into his body. Um, and one of the things that's beautiful about that is in that world where God holds on to people, they're confused and pained by that kind of love for them. They don't understand it. Um, but I think that love is still good for them. And I think anybody can see it, that letting go of that person and saying, you don't matter,
Yeah.
is to buy into the delusion. And I think that's exactly the Christian attitude toward hell. I think there's a good story I have in my paper that I wrote on this, which is Mother Teresa. She used to say, I had this dream. I went up to heaven, and St. Peter was there. And he said, oh, you can't come in here, Mother Teresa. There's no slums in hell. Or slums in heaven. I'm sorry, slums in heaven. There's no slums in heaven. You can't come in here. And she got angry and she walked away and she said, I'll tell you what, St. Peter, I'm going to go get those slum people and bring them up here.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
I tell you what, this is my vision of hell. Is I think this is why, from the perspective of God and from the perspective of the blessed in heaven, the damned matter. They're their loved ones. They're not going to let them go. I think of hell as a place where you might say the antechamber of heaven, or the nursing home, right? People who are confused about why they're being taken care of. But you can think of God and the people in heaven as taking care of those people. They're impaired in how they're seeing God, but it's better for them. It's a sign of God's love and mercy that he's taking care of them. He's doing things that are good for them, even though they don't like it. I worked in a hospice and a nursing home, and we had people that were crazy and got angry at us. And I had somebody throw an oxygen cylinder at my head once.
wow.
Um, and I had to sort of take them out and calm them down and sit with them. And I think there's a beautiful image there at the end that, you know, they're going to be pained and broken, uh, but that is part of what keeps us together and is part of what's good for me, that I love and am concerned about people like that as much as it's good for them. They don't understand it, but it's still good for them. They're just broken the way they're seeing the world. So, of course, they're pained by what's good for them in hell. But that doesn't mean that I lose my duty, lose my obligation of love to be with those people. So that's how I see it, is in the end, our relationship with the people in hell is not going to be a painful one. It's going to be like Mother Teresa in heaven. She used to call the people in this world who were in mortal sin, she said they were the spiritually poorest of the poor, even worse than the materially poorest. So I think maybe Jesus's claim, you know, you'll have the poor always with you, is in fact literal truth about the afterlife. Is maybe that's why God allows it, is because it's part of our unity with other people and with Jesus. So that's something we see though with natural evil too in our life, and moral evil even among the saints. Because when Jesus rose from the dead, he rose with wounds in his hands and his side, and they didn't go away. Uh, when people, the martyrs will arise, many of the church fathers think they're going to have wounds too, but they're going to be transformed and glorious and beautiful. I think that's how I envision the damned, as it were, is they become, through Christ's union with them in the afterlife, they become like that wound in his heart that stays there, and it's painful, but it's something beautiful and glorious and good, because God is holding them close to himself, even though they don't, even though they're pained by it. I think there's really something good and beautiful about it, that would be different if God just allowed them to go their own way. It'd be a worse world if God just allowed them to go do evil, and get even worse and just fade into nothingness from their evil. I think God holding them into his heart would be a much greater good.
You know, I really love that description of hell. And I think that a lot of people really need to get the idea of like pitchforks and torture and you know people actually being burned alive and everything out of their heads. And so what you've kind of done there, like describing how like a nursing home or like holding on to a suicidal loved one, even if they want to let go, even if they think they don't matter, you know, they have this faulty view of reality, just as those who persist in sin do. But you hold on to them, you don't let go. I think that is the kind of, I don't want to say like new vision of hell, because I think what you're describing, like when you mentioned the saints like Maximus and others, like you're just describing what has been part of the Christian tradition. And then later on, like this idea of just like, you know, torture and kind of going crazy with it. You know, that's little t tradition. You know, that's art. That's not really, I think, what the doctrine in the beginning was getting at. Um, so, you know, I think I'll close out the interview by just saying, is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of maybe upcoming work that you have? I think you said you have a third article coming out, or something like that. So I'll kind of give you the space here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I have a third article about this. I have maybe a book that's going to come out about this eventually, where I'm going to try to put together some of the things I've already written about grace and free will with why God allows hell and moral evil. So that's going to be called, I think my cute name for it is Not a Hope in Hell. And the point there at the end is our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is in God's goodness. It's not about hell, free will and grace. It's not a worry. It shouldn't torment us. It shouldn't be something we're anxious about. Perfect love casts out fear. So God doesn't tell us whether we're going to heaven or hell. He's not doing that to scare us. It's part of our growth into being mature Christian adults in the image of Jesus. Is we love God for his own sake, not for particular benefits. That's, I think, where the doctrine of hell with the pitchforks and all that is. That's where I think where it comes from, is people who are getting sort of the wrong idea about why we care about heaven and hell. It's because we care about Jesus. It's because we care about God and being united with him. Hell is the doctrine I could have done otherwise. So I think it's right at the center of our theory of grace. I think I need help to be a good person. I need help from the people on the other side of this camera. So please say a prayer for me. It's why I go to confession. It's because I think I need help from God. I know I trust God that if I trust him, things will be okay. I don't worry about going to hell that way. I worry about, I pray every day that I maintain myself in God's grace. I know I need help. That's what the doctrine of hell teaches us. It's just the inverse of our need for God's grace. That's why I said it doesn't make any sense. It undermines the cross to say you don't need hell is impossible. It undermines the cross because it says I don't need God's help to live a good life. Everything will be fine, right? But I mean, that's universalists get angry with saying something like that. But I mean, the point is there's a deep reason why that attitude looks like it's caught up with universalism, which is because if it is literally necessarily true that I'm going to love God in the end, it turns out that there's something natural to me or to God that I don't need his help at all. But of course, that's the problem. I do need his help, and I need to be conscious of it. So I don't know whether people are going to be in heaven or hell or not. How many people are going to be there? But I know God loves me and loves you and loves the people listening to this. So I think here's the attitude in the end I want to insist on is we want to trust God. And part of trusting God, I think, to be honest, is I think universalism gets it all half-cocked, gets all of Christianity mixed up. And it's not because they're wrong about stuff all the time. They worry about all these complicated things about whether there are second chances after we die, or whether God is going to let anybody persist in hell, or what goods he's going to achieve, or why he allows it. Is it pointless? But what they do is they're focusing on things that lead them to miss the important parts of the picture. Mm-hmm. The important part of the picture is they're proud. they're not hoping in God. And practically speaking, if I can be a little bit frank now, their whole viewpoint breathes being a cult and a sect and groupies. They get caught up these days around personalities. And some of the people I've talked to who give these kind of, I said, these moral intuitions, they'll say things like, even if I found out that God allowed any people to go to hell, if I found out that real Christianity taught that, if I found out the church taught that definitively, if I found out scripture taught that definitively, I wouldn't believe in God anymore. Yeah, I would tell God, go to hell. So you talk to people who believe this, and they'll go through. They'll say, but Scripture allows universalism, and then you show no, it doesn't. There's no real good scriptural interpretation that allows universalism. Okay, the fathers allow universalism. No, they don't. You're misinterpreting these people you're reading. Gregory of Nyssa, is one guy. We don't just follow one church father against the definitive teaching of the church. The church fathers themselves knew Gregory of Nyssa might have believed this. They weren't sure. But I mean, Maximus just reinterprets him as an Orthodox person. Okay. And then the church definitively allows it. Well, no, they don't. And then they just end with, well, I believe it. Right. This is just straightforwardly the spirit of heresy. And you get to see, I think, why heresy is bad. It turns you into an atom. It cuts you off from Christ and from the Christian tradition. It makes you more confident in yourself than other people. I'm not arguing you have to believe there are people in hell and delight over it. I don't think we should delight over that. I think we should pray and work that people don't go to hell. But I mean, there's a lot of this ad hoc reasoning and just willful kind of rejection in the end that this position leads you to. And it cuts you off from the church and from the tradition. So I think it looks like a diabolical attitude to me. It creates a sect, it creates a cult in the Christian church. I think if people want to, believe privately or pray and hope that everyone goes to heaven, that's Hans Urs von Balthasar. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think insisting on this stuff and going after these kind of, creative theologians, let's call them, is just a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster.
All right, Father James, Dominic, thank you for this episode today. And for anybody who's watching who might have questions or objections, obviously in this first part, we didn't cover absolutely everything. We didn't even cover everything that we originally had planned to talk about. So hopefully a second part can do some more justice and also allow Father James Dominic to also include his thoughts then about, his defense of hell and other things too. And so I'm hoping that, if you feel like anything that you wanted mentioned wasn't mentioned in this first part, we can get to in the second part. But Father, thank you so much for coming out and talking to me today.
Happy to be here, Swan. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.